My name's Paul Clark, and I grew up in Utah, and this was during the Great Depression, and so there was very little money for most everybody. And so myself and some of my friends in high school, we joined the National Guard. I was only 16 years of age when we did it, and you were supposed to be 18, but they needed their quota, and so they took us young. And we did some training and made a little extra funds to have to spend. We, on March 1st, 1941, we went into active duty, and they took us to California, where we went into some intensive training. There were rumors going around that we might get into a war, but we really didn't think it would happen. But we went into this training and all spring and summer, and then we knew that we were going to go somewhere in the fall. And came about the 1st of December, why we loaded all our stuff, all of our equipment and our guns on a boat, and we didn't know where we were going. We were in the 145th Field Artillery, and at first we were attached to the 40th Infantry Division, and then when getting to this battle we're going to talk about, they changed us and we were attached to the 7th Army Division. And so we loaded all our equipment on the boat and went to the Marshall Islands in the Pacific. And the Japanese had already conquered most of the islands, the important islands in the Pacific. And so the main island in the Marshall Islands was called Kwajalein, and the plan was for the artillery to go into a small island. It was a narrow, long island that was about a mile off the shore of the main island, and we were going to go in there at night and then shoot our guns for about 36 straight hours to soften up the main island so the infantry could go in and easier. So we got there and spent most all night getting our supplies and equipment and ammunition in place. And there were a lot of guns, and we were the first row, and they were so narrow that the guns were almost hub to hub. And the guns in back of us all had to shoot over the top of us. So we were to start shooting the next morning, and I was about 50 yards away from the guns watching, and they told us to load up the guns and gave the order to fire. And we shot shells that were about this big around, 155 millimeters. And they were about this long and weighed about 100 pounds. They put it in the breech of the gun and said fire, and the gun, or the projectile, didn't go out of the gun. It exploded in the gun, and it just riddled the gun barrel all to pieces. And of course it killed about 3 of our men, and a couple of them lost an arm and one lost a leg. And it was kind of a chaos. And the soldiers didn't want to fire anymore, because that was the very first shell of the war, and they were afraid the next shell they put in, the same thing would happen. It did not. They had to fire. They grumbled about it, but they did it anyway, and they didn't have any explosion again. But we fired all that day, and all the other guns did with us, and as I indicated, they were shooting over our head, and we went right into the night, and we were going to fire all night long. And I had been up all the night before, and it was about 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning, and I was still up working, and I was just exhausted, and I felt I had to lie down for a little while. And so I went over to the where the telephone operator was, and I laid down by the telephone operator because I thought if they needed me, they could get me on the telephone. I was the first sergeant, and I was over the 112 men at the time, and then there was a captain officer that was over me. And after the men almost mutinied, we're not going back and fire, you know. And somebody told the captain to get them firing, and of course he didn't tell the men to. He told me to tell the men to get it going. And they all hated me for that. But they fired all into that night. And I laid down by the telephone operator, and I'd only, all the guns going off, such a terrible noise, and I went to sleep just like that. And I don't know, I hadn't been asleep very long, and I felt an impression that I should get up and move. And I thought, oh, I'm so tired, and I didn't do it. And shortly after that, why, another impression came to me that I should get up and move. And I thought, well, I better do it, but I was slow about it. And a voice came to me that said, get up and move now. And it was just about like that. It wasn't a loud voice or anything. And this is an absolutely true story. And so that really got my attention, and I jumped up and I ran. I ran about 75 yards from where we were. And I hadn't got to this spot, wasn't there more than a minute. And one of the guns that was close behind us, shooting over our heads, exploded just like ours did in the morning. And theirs was even worse than ours. They had more people killed and more maimed also. And it was real chaos then. But after things settled down for a while, and they had to start shooting again, and they did it, but I walked over back where I was to the telephone, and I looked, and there was a big hole in the ground about this big around, and it was about this deep, and in that hole was a big jagged piece of metal about like this. It was part of that gun barrel that blew up. So if I hadn't have moved, obviously I would have been killed, and because it was exactly where my head was lying. And so I was real, it got my attention. It really made me feel good that I wasn't dead, and could have been at the time. So we continued firing and until the next morning, and then we stopped, and the infantry moved in, and we thought, oh gosh, we've been shelling that place so bad, there won't be anything left of them. But there was. The infantry had a hard time taking it over. They were well dug in, and they were very determined to keep their fortress, and they would not, they'd take a little space of ground, and the Japanese would not give up, and they had to kill every Japanese on that island, and none of them actually survived. They fought to the bitter end. And this took a good 3 days. It wasn't a huge island, of course, and it took the infantry about 3 days to secure it. And there was nothing for us there in this little island out in the middle of the Pacific, and so we started gathering our stuff up, and we did put it back on a boat again. And they put us on what was called an LST. It's a flat bottom boat, and they kind of roll in the water. they don't have a keel like a regular boat, but they can go right up on the beach. Anyway, we were about a third of the way back to Hawaii. That's where we took off from. And we had been in Hawaii for some time. And we were glad to go back there. And to go back just a little bit, we were on the boat, left San Francisco in the first part of December 1941, and we were on the boat when Pearl Harbor happened. And we were on our way to the Philippine Islands, and we didn't know it at the time, but they told us after we got out of ways. And they decided that the Japanese were going to take over the Hawaiian Islands, and so they took us back to Hawaii. And we stayed there for a year and a half probably, and supposed to guard Pearl Harbor and Honolulu, and which we did. And we had our guns set up on the Honolulu golf course. We loved that and hoped that we could stay there the whole war. But it didn't work out this way. And then we knew, though, that we were going to have to do this island hopping and take these islands back that the Japanese had conquered. So that our first experience, of course, was this going to the Marshall Islands and taking over Kwajalein. And then we were on our way back to Hawaii, and the motor on the boat that we were on gave out.